Hello. My name's Nabel, and I'm going to briefly introduce Jasper. So in this, Jasper wrote this essay called Logistics, Counterlogistics in the Communist Prospect that was published in Endnotes journal, and it asks this question at the very beginning: what is theory for? And he says there are two types of theory: pedagogic theory that tells you what to do and what to think, and another non-didactic kind of theory, which Jasper says simply reflects, synthesizes, which simply reflects, synthesizes, and perhaps accelerates the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age, which is to say that the makings of theory are already there in everyday life, and that they're elaborated in the process of struggle. The theorist can help clarify what is already being said. And he says, theory is more a map than a set of directions, a survey of the terrain in which we find ourselves, a way of getting our bearings in advance of any risky course of action. So I think that's pretty cool. This is what's at stake in theory, the possibility of linking the collective intelligence articulated in struggles against every form of exploitation and oppression, with the necessary clarifications that connect struggles to their horizons and beyond to a world worth living in. So yeah, that's kind of been, that's stuck in my brain, and it was one of the first things I read by Jasper, I think, except for some of his poetry. So that's kind of like in his work as a theorist, but also Jasper is an artist. As far as I know, he's going to talk about art today. And he also theorizes about art. He wrote a book called The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization. And he also makes it as a poet and a writer. And he facilitates its creation and circulation as a publisher. So then another question arises, which is, what is art for? Or maybe even better, what is poetry for? Fortunately, I don't have to answer that. So that's Jasper's job. But it does seem like art must have something to say about the world and something to say about fighting for the world we want. There's an essay called Period Style in the Art of the Present that Jasper, Juliana, Spahr, and Joshua Clover collaborated on. And those are his collaborators at Commune Editions also. Which triangulates theory, pop, and riot as related aesthetic coordinates that decorate the present. They say that this is one of the things pop has to say to both theory and riot. We are not out of it yet. We are still in the world of the commodity. Let us not pretend otherwise. We are still magnetized by the present moment. Let us not pretend otherwise. It is incomparably beautiful. Let us not pretend otherwise. It has to burn. Let us not pretend otherwise. So also, since I'm introducing him, I should say some things about what Jasper does. He lives in Berkeley with his family. He seems to write a lot and does a lot in general. He's a dad, a poet, a teacher, an editor of a poetry imprint, Commune Editions, and also of an amazing political magazine, coincidentally also called Commune Magazine. And I don't know how he does all those things. It's extremely impressive. I was going to make one of those Chuck Norris jokes about Jasper, but if you remember those, but they're actually not funny, it turns out. Sorry, I think that made it even worse. Okay. So I'll say one last thing. Jasper believes, or seems to believe, against all appearances to the contrary, that a radically different world is possible and that we have to fight for it. One of Jasper's projects is to show, in an unusually sober way, how that world could come into being. And sometimes that means the nuts and bolts, like how will we eat after the revolution? And sometimes it's through poems and stories that give us a glimpse into another possibility of life, into the possibility of revolution. And maybe this is the place where art and theory sort of collide. So, welcome to Jasper.
Thanks, Nabel. Thanks, Nabel, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me? Is this working? Oh, this one. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Nabel. And thanks, everyone, for bringing me here to Evergreen and Olympia. I get to hang out with Nabel. He's one of my favorite people. And it's an honor to be here. All my life, I've been surrounded by Evergreen alumni and Evergreen people, or people who dropped out of Evergreen, or people who spent time here, in other words. I'm married to one. I run a magazine with one, and one of my closest friends in the world also is one. So, but I've never really, done much on campus, but yet I feel a kind of kinship to this place. So, yeah, I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the book of poetry that I wrote, which was my second book of poems, We Are Nothing, and So Can You. And it really, the book is a kind of reflection on a period of time that I passed through, a kind of series of, political events that I passed through and that the world passed through in the wake of the economic crisis of 2008. And I think of it as there's a kind of political sequence that begins, shortly after the economic crisis, and that, extends for half a decade or a little bit longer. And I think you'd probably say that it ended sometime in 2014 or 2015. And we're now in a very different political moment. And I won't talk about that so much, but I do think that the world's quite different now. So, some of you maybe don't remember this particularly well, but others will. There was this kind of massive economic crisis. People were quite destitute and quite desperate. There was, a lot of people lost their houses. A lot of people were out of work, and it was global. And yet, right at the beginning, right after the crisis, there didn't seem to be much political response. And for me, that was, saddening, because there was so much misery that was so clearly caused by the kind of sort of carelessness of the kind of rulers of the world, and a result of the kind of the fact that we lived in a system that really didn't care for the kind of majority of people. But slowly but surely, things, a resistance movement did emerge, first in kind of other places, and then slowly within the United States. Partly I think one of the things that happened is that there was the, election of Obama, and people had all these kinds of, hopes around him, and it took a little while for those to wear off and people to realize that, he wasn't going to do any of the things that he said he was going to do. I think one of the first kind of resistant movements in the United States was a kind of student movement in California, in 2009 and 2010. There'd been the kind of Wisconsin uprising around public sector unions, and that happened at the same time. But until then, until the student movement, there hadn't really been much resistance. Occupy was still a year away or so. And I was, deeply involved in that in California, and it gave me a kind of sense of sort of hope that there was a possibility, for a possibility of resistance. And, because basically what happened is that in the wake of the crisis, the kind of state university system in California tried to kind of raise tuition by an exorbitant amount. I think it was 30%. And they learned from that, and they never in the future really tried to raise it that much, because you can raise it 10% and you won't get a riot, but if you try to raise it 30%, it'll cause the whole system to explode, which is what happened. And we took over campuses and buildings and occupied things, and we were committed to kind of bringing back a series of confrontational tactics that had largely disappeared from the United States, and trying to kind of always see where we could kind of push things. And so, I participated in that, and that was in some ways kind of my introduction to a kind of whole world of resistance. I hadn't really had opportunities to participate in things that felt politically meaningful before that. and I met a lot of people, and I kind of found a community of like-minded people. And then, from that moment on, there were just all kinds of anti-police riots in the Bay Area that were really significant. That had actually started a little bit before that. There was the kind of Occupy movement, Occupy Oakland, which was a really transformational experience. And so during that time, I was already a poet, and I was kind of writing poems about my own experiences, things that I had experienced directly, or things that were happening in the world, and trying to kind of reflect on where we were and what it said about capitalism and kind of the possibilities for the future. And so, I think that this book of poems really comes out of that moment. It comes out of a kind of active attempt to think through it. And I sometimes think of it as it's almost like a collaborative process. I was writing it with all of the people that were struggling in all these different kinds of ways in the world at the time, some of whom I knew and some of whom I had no relationship to because they were doing things in places that were thousands of miles away. So that the title, "We Are Nothing and So Can You," I didn't actually invent that. That was something that was graffitied on the wall of a building in downtown Santa Cruz on the night of a kind of riot, I think in 2010. And I may actually know the person who wrote it. I have some suspicion that I probably do, but I actually don't know who it was. So that's sort of how this thing came about. There's kind of language that's emerging out of the streets and out of these acts of resistance, and I'm kind of working with it. So the origin of the title I think says something about the project as a whole. And here it is. It's not very pretty, the writing, but nonetheless that is where it comes from. It's partly a pun on a line from the kind of Internationale, the kind of anthem of the workers' movement, which in English is translated as "We are nothing and must become everything." In the French version, it's "Nous sommes rien, soyons tout," and that's a sort of weird verb tense. But anyways, it's a kind of pun on that. And one of the things that I'm interested in terms of protest movements and riots and mass movements and insurgencies is the way that they, in order to kind of figure out how to do something, they have to kind of ransack the past for ideas and phrases and tactics and strategies and sort of make something out of them and try to make them new and try to figure out a way forward through this repertoire of practices that the revolutionary past bequeaths to us. And oftentimes that sometimes there's a bad form of it where you end up kind of going backward, or you end up being some kind of historical reenactment society, and oftentimes the kind of left falls into this. But sometimes you can combine elements in a new way that really does make it possible to see the future. I really like this quote by Marx, where he talks about this, and he says, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus, Luther put on the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 95. In like manner, the beginner who has learned a new language always translates it back into his mother tongue, but he assimilates the spirit of the new language and expresses himself freely in it only when he moves in it without recalling the old and when he forgets his native tongue, right? So you need these kinds of things as like a transitional instrument in order to do something new. You just the old is just this thing you use up in order to actually find the new. It's a bridge, but sometimes you end up just getting kind of stuck in the past. So that's a lot of what is happening in this book that I wrote. There's reflections on things that were happening in the 2000s. But I was reading a lot of revolutionary history at the time, and I'm kind of interested in these resonances and the way the kind of past kind of flashes up in the present. And I was also interested in the way that the kind of possible futures emerge out of these kinds of moments of resistance. I mean, there's something when you're part of a really kind of antagonistic movement, and when you're kind of in the middle of, say, Occupy Oakland, and we were shutting down the city with 60,000 people and taking over the port, and you really had this sense that anything was possible, that an insurrection was possible, that it was possible for a kind of moment like that to spread. And you have to be. I sort of think about it as that movements like that make people a little bit. They make people a little bit crazy. They make people sort of able to imagine something could happen that when we look at it now, we think, of course there was no chance, right? But at the time, so many people do feel that there is a chance, and I think that that's a really important aspect of them, is that and if enough people really if enough people think something is possible, sometimes that makes it possible, right? So that's it's kind of important to be able to get into that moment of almost being kind of delusional enough to think that certain things are possible, even if 10 years later it doesn't look like it at all. So the book essentially moves back and forth between these moments in the present that conjure up the past, and then these kinds of science fictional futures that are embedded in the book. And that movement between present, past, and future is captured in the book in a movement between sections that are written in lineated poetry and in what we might call verse, and then sections that are written in prose. And so the prose sections are the future. They're kind of slightly speculative. They seem to take place in some kind of weird future moment, and then and then the verse sections, the lineated sections, more or less correspond to the present of the poem, but not exactly. So I'll read a couple sections and then talk about some other things. I'll try to read some of the verse and the non-verse sections. Let's see. Okay, so here's I'll start with a prose section. Because there were more rules than there were things, many more, countlessly more, because indeed the rules made little whirlpools of infinite abandon inside the things, which seemed removed the more they seemed ruled, and because everyone and everything seemed to have its own rule, its own disenchanted genius, so that no one could really be said to be ruled at all if rule then meant a domination we shared. Because anarchy, in other words, and each of us slated to suffer a unique violence, a violence like a name with nothing general about it. Some thought this meant that communism was already here. Others thought it meant communism was impossible. since we would never be able to match up the electrical flares in our brains with the patterned inertia we encountered. But wasn't that the point? The unworkable? At least we were tired of it, whatever it was, tired of rehearsing under the rotting awnings a few moments of unverified intimacy from the last hours of the little credit we had left. Was that seriously what was meant by art? After all the bandages had been removed? We had burned all the banks by the sea. Ours was not a normal darkness, not, in other words, the darkness of shadow, of obscuration, light blocked by solids. No, ours was a radiant darkness. It spread out from our skin like any shining, except that it canceled shine. Dragged into the clearing at the heart of all hell breaking loose, it fled from us and into the stars. Kicking through the liquid crystal displays into the musty rooms of pimply middle-class adolescents intent on bringing down the government for reasons no one could articulate, because all articulation is, in fact, raison d'etat, a red herring at best. The most you can do is trick it out to fit the limits of your particular human organism, its mangled sensorium. We get an old city bus and give it the number of a line that doesn't exist, 47 or 810. Immediately, we exclude all those sad characters who know where they are going and want to go there, who think in terms of means and ends, origin and destination, or who are compelled to do so for reasons of material or perhaps moral circumstance. This narrows our range of writers less than you might imagine. Indeed, we estimate that at any one moment, fully 1/5 of all passengers are there for reasons other than the desire to get somewhere in particular. People who could care less where the bus is going, as long as it's going. People whose bodies are exhausted and just want a place to sit down. Kids who are more interested in each other than anything else, and who follow with collapsed heads the colored signscape of the world. People who carry their faces in their hands. People who carry things in plastic bags. People who carry other people. Eventually, we have so many buses running, so many constantly improvised lines, and so many partisans running into and out of the buses and grabbing provisions off the shelves of corner shops with or without guns, and taking the gas that we need from the gas stations with or without guns, and taking the gas, with or without leaving behind the mutilated corpses of police, and getting off one bus and onto another, that the buses become like the rooms of a disarticulated mansion, whirling through space and crossing and recrossing, combining and disassembling in a stupid manic dance. Some buses are entirely dedicated to sleeping and some to eating. Some buses are 24-hour dance parties. And on some buses, people bicker continuously. There are theoretical buses and flirtatious buses. There are sanitation buses and fully armed bank-robbing buses, and buses that hate all the other buses. There are so many of these buses spinning through the city that eventually it truly is as if they were themselves the only thing stationary in a crazy world jumping about in every direction, as if space had too many dimensions to be space, but not enough to be time. Okay, so next section. In London, they make it French and Greece in different voices, make it rain, location on vacation, like all the Puerto Rican barricades, reroute the roads to Rome. You can blockade them from home by remote control, scramble the traffic signals, make it January in July in Oakland, Billy's in the Nazi room, Claire's in the loading dock in the US. They still make money. In China, they can make anything take time by combination of parts made of making do. We can't make out the places on the map they've made dark in daylight, in time for New York to sink behind the paywall, the lake of ink, the make and model, scaled up to circle the squares forever, to drown the crowds in open skies. Okay, so the next prose section I'm going to read, I'll just say that it was one of the last parts written in the book, even though it comes in the middle. And I was having a hard time finishing this book in 2014 and 2015 because things had kind of slowed down. It was sort of a depressing period. There wasn't as much kind of contestation, and it was clear that this kind of cycle was kind of running down, and a lot of the kind of movements and revolutionary eruptions that had happened a few years ago, they'd kind of taken on this like dark, almost kind of right-wing turn in some places, and it was just kind of a less hopeful time for me. But I was incredibly moved by the sort of struggles around Black Lives Matter, and particularly in Ferguson, which were so unique, and in particular in the way that they just didn't stop. Ferguson, they were just out there every night, night after night for months, and there's something really kind of remarkable about the kind of localization of that struggle in space and then its extension in time. And it seemed a real breakthrough, and it still does. And so that, once that happened, the kind of Ferguson moment enabled me to finish the book, because I just couldn't write when I didn't have a certain hopefulness about the world. I couldn't finish the book because it was written during this period, and most of it was written in this period in 2012, where I had this sense of a kind of open prospect, and it was only in 2014 when that came back with Black Lives Matter movements and Ferguson in Baltimore that I really had that again. So I rushed to finish the book because I thought it might end, and it did. So this is in some ways a kind of reflection on that moment. By summer's end, we learned much later, no one could agree about when the disturbances began. A dozen years ago, last year, earlier this month, visitors to that part of the city were likely to hear a different answer each time they asked. Anti-riot agents coated every surface of the zone, dulling the green of the trees. The sharp, sweet smell of the gas residue was the first thing you noticed once you crossed the river. And some residents suspected these chemicals were the cause of their newfound incapacity with time. In the cafes, impromptu philosophers sat among the shattered tables and chairs, debating whether calendar time even applied in the zone. The riots were rather like the lunar rhythm of the tides, they said, or the layering of weather on weather that formed a climate, spreading through the interconnected neighborhoods as heat diffuses through a block of metal. Indeterminacy in time was offset, however, by the fixed position of the zone in space, skewered by the pushpins stuck in 100 police maps. Walk a couple of miles in any direction, and the calm was absolute, more terrifying by contrast than the worst night of wooden bullets and water cannons, the curbs shining with brightly painted color coding, the asphalt as smooth and lineless as a baby's face, affable citizens queuing up in front of the cupcakeries, shaking hands as they greeted the bland regularity of another day. And it was not just the immediate environs. Large parts of the country seemed pacified, docile, bright, and crimeless, and tediously polite. The radius of pacification was spreading day by day as the national newspapers reported. There were theories, of course, that the rioters were simply the nocturnal avatars of well-behaved citizens from beyond the zone, but none of the photographs could match faces with existing records. Some suspected that deviants from other parts of the country were being deposited in the zone. There were rumors about secret flights, nocturnal renditions, people with cloth sacks over their heads being marched across the bridge. If this were true, the government put up a good show. Entire universities were devoted to studying the phenomenon, developing new weapons and police tactics. Clergy descended on the zone. Billions of dollars were funneled into nonprofits to address the sources of the disturbance. Governmental panels met continuously for the better part of a year, a decade, a century. But then one afternoon toward twilight, while the drones congregated above the river, an elderly man came out from the apartment blocks, and instead of beginning to gather the loose rocks and bricks into a pile, lay down among the debris and went to sleep. Soon, another old man came out, and he lay down as well. Eventually, the whole neighborhood was there, in the street, parents and grandparents, friends and cousins, lying together in a big pile as if they had happily expired. Nothing happened that night in the zone. Nothing was lit on fire. Nothing smashed into little pieces. There were no angry declamations, no projectiles. The zone was the calm eye of a storm whose scale was orders of magnitude larger, for thousands of miles in all directions, city after city swept up in the outcry. And then went downtown, disguised as minor characters who find no end of objects turning space to price. They have named something after you, another gaunt outlet chainsawed through solid paraphrase, the blunt force of not trying to hear, scattered in lines and arcs like labor time evaporating in a riot. I step out of the hotel into the last of all possible worlds. What reason could I possibly give? When the lights turned back on, every inch of the city tagged up with inequalities. As if again assigned to the burning system of piecework let out to the black mass of just-in-time execution, while you navigate the transcendental loop athwart overturning a cop car as art and doing it where the bad neighborhood of real life abuts the state. Like everything that shits on you consistently, a question of timing. That's what the state is in the end, an appointment book with a gun, the days stamped onto the metropolitan superfists, an entire choreography of dates whose purpose is to schedule other dates when one's confinement to a point in space cut deep into time will be decided. You lost your way in the tear gas one night, out of the burning places and back into the catacombs of endless work and talk, the ranked textures colliding with the force field emitted from the traffic lights to produce notions of value and utility. No wonder you just say fuck it and do something really sketchy, or go to graduate school, or get into building bikes. As again, the vats fill up with blood, with our blood, and again, the amphibious thing crawls out of the Victorian prose and gets all up in our face. A mass of bloodied paperwork become a viscous pulp from which limbs emerge, then trunks, then heads, then the police, army, and postal service all in one. It's not believing that maims, but believing and not believing as if it were a dim anchor extruded from the neutral hiding places, as if you didn't just live here. So that's that book. Oh yeah, so the one thing I was going to say about the prose-verse alternation, just because I think there's students in classes here who maybe study literature, an interesting thing about that I often tell students when I'm teaching poetry and literature more broadly is that prose etymologically derives from the Latin for forward-facing or moving forward or turned forward, whereas verse comes from the word for to turn, right? So prose, and we kind of intuitively sense this, prose kind of moves in a straight line, it keeps going, it's one thing after another, but a poem is constantly turning back on itself, right? It's constantly turning at line end, it's going back to the beginning, it has this kind of circular movement. And so, in this book, I'm kind of moving between a kind of more forward-looking, forward-facing kind of prose that's looking to the future and then kind of turning back to the past or turning upon the present. Now, if you combine a kind of linear movement with a circular movement, what do you get? What happens when you combine kind of rotational movement with linear movement? you get a kind of spiraling motion, right? You're actually changing place, but you're turning upon yourself in one direction. And so that's sort of how the book moves. It's a kind of spiral movement, or at least I like to think of it. In some ways, I think that's kind of how history moves, right? That's this dynamic that I'm talking about kind of that in the Marx quote, where kind of revolutions have to recover the past in order to move forward. It's a spiral movement, ideally, right? You go backwards in order to recapture these things, but then in fact to kind of change place, right? So there's a circular dimension to kind of historical movement, and this is captured in the idea of there being kind of repetition or history being circular, but that's not quite right? Because things aren't exactly circular, right? We may exist in this moment when it's clear the civilization that we live in is not going to last very long. We're not going to exactly end up back in the Middle Ages, but we're going to end up somewhere other than this. And so there's a kind of spiral motion to it, and those are it's like you can decompose the movement of history into these two terms: one a line, one a circle. I try to capture that in the book. So this is my truly terrible visual, right? But and the technical name for a book of poetry that combines both prose and verse is the prosometrium. It's an old form, because poetry used to be much more various before the kind of modern age, and people would use it to write kind of philosophical disquisitions or give instructions or recipes or whatever. So there's a lot of kind of old Latin texts that move back and forth between prose and poetry. So, okay, so that's your moment of kind of literary nutrition for the day. I've introduced some terms. Okay, so this display doesn't give me a time. Can you tell me? Can I get a time check? 12:22. Okay. So in We Are Nothing and So Can You, I'm using the first person plural, right? It's written around this kind of we. And there's certain things, a we kind of has this immediacy. It's a kind of collectivity that feels kind of tight. There's a kind of, a we kind of assumes some kind of similarity among all the people within the we. That's the nature of the we, right? It emphasizes that kind of togetherness. But a couple years after a lot of the stuff that I wanted to write about had happened, or a lot of the stuff that I write about in this book had happened, I thought to kind of write about it with a bit more distance. And so instead of writing in we, which didn't really feel right at that time, I tried to play around with they. So I essentially took this kind of collective subject that is the we of the earlier book and said, okay, well, what happens if it's a they rather than a we, And they is really a kind of very interesting word. The status of they in our language is changing right now, as fusty old places like the Washington Post come to accept that the singular they is something that you can use. And this has a kind of relationships, the kind of struggles of transgender and non-binary people for kind of recognition and sort of a kind of change in the character of pronouns within the language. And this sort of they can be this thing that both refers to a number of people. It can be a kind of it can be a singular. And I think we're maybe moving to a kind of language where they is just becomes a kind of impersonal pronoun of the sort that other languages actually have. We have very terrible impersonal pronouns in English. If you know other languages, they have very flexible impersonal pronouns that you can do a lot of stuff with, and we end up with really awkward constructions like one, and just our language is very weak in that regard. And so maybe they is allowing for this kind of new kind of plasticity around pronouns. So that's just one of the things that I was trying to kind of think about. And they is sort of interesting in that it could be, because it could be both singular and plural, it could refer to a single person, but also a group. And there's something about that, about being part of a kind of movement where you're both singular and collective. And I think that I was able to kind of, in sort of writing from the perspective or point of view of they, I was able to just think different kinds of things. And this is the thing that I'm going to read from a little bit, is it's more of a short story than it is a work of poetry. And what I'm really interested in playing with is what's technically called free and direct discourse, which is a kind of use of literary language where you have a character and they're introduced by a kind of third person pronoun, he, she, they, etc. But you're sort of directly presented with their thoughts. They're not attributed with he said or she said, etc. You're kind of directly presented with them. And this is, I mean, everybody is familiar with it. Everybody has read and knows naturally how to recognize the grammar as indicating this kind of interior mind state. And we often use it for representing thought. It gives you access to the mind of a character, what they're thinking. But it's called free and direct discourse and not free and direct thought because you can also use it to do speech. And speech could be speech that you don't really know who is saying it. So there's this kind of use of free and direct discourse that is really exciting for me because it can describe a use of speech where it's not really attached to a particular person. It's like the crowd saying it. And there's also this they free and direct discourse that's kind of used in some novels where it's like, it's sort of what the village thinks. It's like gossip. The status of this gossip, it's like somebody is saying this thing, but you don't know exactly who. And it's this kind of collective thought or collective speech that doesn't belong to a particular person. It belongs to the they. So I was kind of really interested in those literary kind of very nerdy techniques in order to get at these political questions. So I'm just going to read shortly. They were ex-cons and grad students. Oh, by the way, this story is called Michael Jackson, and I won't read to the end so you won't know why it's called that. But they were ex-cons and grad students, fractious Bolsheviks and urban castaways, rock throwers and pot smokers, juggalos and candy kids. They were people angry at their chances or at someone else's. They were there because they were trying to make art about it, or because it was a safe place to sell drugs, or they just wanted to fight the cops. They were houseless and jobless. They were shrill and outraged. They had bizarre ideas about the gold standard. They talked about full communism. They mumbled to themselves and burned with rage and regret. They had tenure. They were from the neighborhood. Earlier, there had been a large and largely aimless march of thousands that looped around the city, dissolving into riot and reforming in various rivulets that flowed back to their starting place. Most of them had arrived late, tracking the march with their smartphones and cutting diagonals to catch up with it. This was a time in history when they could watch themselves from above on a live stream from a helicopter on little handheld screens. Though if they were smart, they dressed in such a way that they couldn't make themselves out when they were part of the large, surging mass, but only when they broke from the edges to leave small fires and broken windows and various messages to the degenerate leaders of the planet before the march ended and deposited them all in the encampment in the square, domed now by the wet thudding of the rotors and ringed with cries. It was very loud. The noise from the helicopters and sirens and a throbbing public address system joined the rising and falling roar of the motley horde. They measured their power in sound, not as volume, but as an indescribable quality of sound, a tone, a vacillating hollow in the center of sound, in which nothing and everything could be heard, in which everything that could be said was said by someone, somewhere. Their power was like that too, a vacillation. Sometimes power meant an ability to produce events, to break the law in a particular way without being stopped, and to keep breaking it, for instance, by piling tents together in a large public square and establishing kitchens and libraries and daycares and holding concerts and distributing needed supplies while violating dozens of municipal ordinances regarding health and safety, as well as state and federal laws, and offending the sensibilities of the better class of people. But mostly power just meant that things happened differently than they did when scripted by the flows of information and electricity and money. Their power meant more or less a proliferation of unpredictable human behaviors. Power was, in this sense, less a measure of success than of volatility, the dials whipping back and forth or spinning in place, the lights on the control panel blinking red, yellow, orange. They could not be simply indifferent to outcomes, however. That was the catch. It was only power because their desire was directed, if not effective. They couldn't just, do whatever. They were trying to have a meeting. They really needed to have a meeting, they said, after gathering as many of themselves as possible from the throng. There was a plan to have a meeting to make a plan, because they would be attacked soon, they said, yelling over the roar. They would be attacked either by the police or by their proxies. They were certain of it. If not tonight, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then next week. And they needed a plan. They needed to defend themselves. Part of the problem, as they had heard themselves say before, was that they really didn't know who they were, who it was who would stay and stand to defend what they had built, and who would stand around and watch. There were so many watchers. It was a movement of spectators, people who held their phones in front of their faces while others were being beaten by the police, people who were in the streets but only in as much as the streets were an extension of the screens and keys and radio frequencies that formed a space they all agreed to hallucinate together. These people were not them. Or rather, they were a them, but not a them as they meant it here, not a them as the you of a we. The people who stood around in the streets with their cameras understood the movement they were part of as the coordination of an indignity, as the distribution of images of suffering along the circuits of the globe. The people who stood around in the streets with their cameras wanted to be beamed up by the helicopters, pixelated and dusted across the planet. The people who stood around but not up would not defend the fragile thing that had been built. They were sitting in a lumpy ellipse behind a low granite wall that opened onto an alley. Their clothes smelled of tear gas. They held in their body the feeling that just being able to sit for a minute or two was like lowering oneself into cool, clear water on a hot day. Someone none of them recognized came running out of the alley. Hey, tell that guy to stop taking my picture. Why is he trying to take my picture?" He vaulted the wall and disappeared into the crowd. His pursuer tried to close the distance, but was swallowed up by a band of middle school mariachis. And I'll just skip a little bit and read one more part. They eventually have the meeting. Okay. The meeting was more or less over, even though it had, they supposed, hardly begun. They agreed to defend the camp, to sweep out in a great arc through the city, wreaking havoc and exacting revenge in the aftermath of the police raid. They agreed to fight until the end, to get arrested peacefully, to build massive barricades from the Christmas decorations the city had piled up in a nearby alley, to booby-trap their tents, to broadcast their plight to the world and ask for international solidarity and an investigation by the UN, to curse and shriek and lob projectiles at the police, to commandeer vehicles and leave them in the streets surrounding and use them to block the various approaches to the plaza, to do some things they didn't need to talk about, to get confused and panicked and go home and lie down next to their children and wonder what the fuck really happened. It was dinner time in the plaza and in general in the neighborhoods that surrounded it. From the kitchen area, a vaguely curried steam began to drift in their direction. The sounds of metals and ceramics and other materials banging against each other suddenly sharper in the evening chill. The camp provisioned itself largely from the leavings of the moneyed classes, that is, from the materials thrown into dumpsters by specialty and health food markets, which usually consisted of various fad foods that had sat on the shelves until their sell-by date. Kimchi beef jerky and Cool Ranch kale chips, goji berries, pickled fiddlehead ferns, asparagus-flavored vegan ice cream, paleo cookies, bison meat, duck eggs, and ginseng lemonade. To this, they added staples that they purchased, dumpstered, or stole, day-old breads, rice, lentils, and beans. Farmers would bring them whatever vegetables they couldn't sell at the markets, and their supporters would order them pizzas at all hours of the day. Once, during a standoff with the cops, 2 different pizza delivery persons stood on either side of the line of police, swaying under stacks of pizza boxes so high only their hats were visible. Some of them tried and failed to get the crowd chanting, "Let my pizza go! Let my pizza go!" It was difficult to move beyond donut jokes when it came to humor in the face of the police. They would receive giant black trash bags full of donuts from the nearby shops, and though eating them was one possibility, many preferred instead to lob them toward the police, borne aloft by various taunts. Cooking for the motley hundreds that came to eat was not unlike one of those cooking competition shows in which contestants were given the most improbable combination of elements and forced to improvise something not only edible but enjoyable. Constrained optimization, wasn't that what the economists called it? They remembered that from college, but also from the time they'd spent in prison. They'd gather together whatever commissary goods their cellmates had lying around: salsa, soy sauce, potato chips, ramen, pepperoni, dump them into a big trash bag, and then cook everything by sticking the positive and negative wires of a stripped power cord into the bag. It was faster than a microwave, and the bag never melted, though who knows what kinds of chemicals leached into their food. The food tonight had the virtue, compared to their prison meals, of maintaining the integrity of its component parts. A peasant stew of heirloom beans and texturized soy protein, enlivened with cilantro someone claimed had been stolen from the city manager's backyard garden. A dish the cooks called satanic goat, that was made with some sort of meat in a sauce somewhere between vindaloo and Korean barbecue, and made somehow from fig Newtons. A salad of buckwheat, macadamia nuts, and mulberries, an alcoholic punch that was the result of various juices fermented in camp, a cannabis fudge that was so dangerously narcotic that in the fudge had become camp slang for extremely intoxicated. They sat and ate in clumps of various sizes and densities, radiating outward from the kitchen along crooked paths they had lined with old pallets and straw to keep the place from becoming a total swamp. They sat and ate on a collection of debased and half-functioning furniture, so various as to give one a sense that truly anything was possible, the contents of 100 broken-necked apartments spilled out into the lamplit visibilities of the night. This was perhaps what was most radical about what they were doing: this opening, this becoming visible of what it took to live, to survive, to flourish even. It was one thing to turn the world upside down, but as it happened, and as so many revolutions had shown, it was pretty easy for life to go on as it had before, with everyone walking on the ceiling instead of the floor. It was another thing altogether to turn the world inside out, to put on the surface all of those daily and habitual things that were normally run through the insides of buildings, hidden away like wiring and pipework. Here, the roots were exposed, submitted for inspection, and though they were not necessarily changeable immediately, at least one could see what it would mean to actually live another way, what it would mean to substitute for a division of labor in which some of them did one thing and then others did another, more pleasant thing, a division of tasks in which they were always doing various things all the time and never relegated to taking out the trash or cleaning pots for all eternity. What it would mean to organize things without compulsion, without either carrot or stick, incentive or punishment. The result was a total shit show, of course, one that showed nothing so much as their total inability to do anything without the fists of the puppet masters of money and violence clenched around their internal organs, forcing their speech and action. There were problems for which they had no solution, problems that could not be solved on the basis of a patch of grass and a pile of food. They needed to expropriate everything around them, and even then they need to construct some things that weren't available, and only when no one could make it impossible for someone else to live except by submitting themselves to another, it would be possible for them to be themselves, to be neither one of nor one with them, but simply them, different both inside and out, and at any moment. Thanks. Sure. Yeah.
What came to me when you were speaking was hope.
Uh-huh. Good.
There's a proverb that says that when hope is deferred, it makes the heart sick. But when desire is fulfilled, it is a tree of life. As I listen very closely, you know, and you display no escapism or trying to get out of a certain place. But during that place, because I know Ferguson, I'm from Missouri, so I understand. But as you wrote, it seems like the entire time there still was hope. So the question I ask is, how do you cultivate a level of hope that you have?
That's a great question. It's it's been hard lately. You know, I mean, when people are resisting in the streets, I mean, I've just seen. I try to remember what I've seen, and I try to remember the best that I've seen from people. You know, what to me, what has changed my life is being in these places where the rules that operate normally are suspended for some reason, and I see people confront a problem, and I see just the incredible creativity and commitment and kind of solidarity and care that people have for each other that just comes and is, I believe, is incredibly, you know, prevalent and distributed among human beings. I do believe that there is this desire to kind of improve situations, to figure out how to live better and live well and take care of each other, and this kind of baseline regard that I've seen come out in these moments. And I know that's not the only thing that makes humans what they are, but I do think that that's how revolution comes about. And you know, these moments where people are really allowed to kind of to self-organize, to decide how they would do things and how they want to do things and what they can do, and help each other. And you know, you see it after disasters, you see it in any kind of moment of crisis. And I just try to hold on to that. You know, I just try to hold on to that knowledge that there's this creative capacity. You know, and that's great, because that means I don't have to figure it out, right? That means that, you know, a million of us together are much smarter than I'll ever be. I don't have the answers. I just need to like listen to that situation and you know, look for that moment where that creative kind of impulse is being allowed to flourish. And you know, sometimes there's not a lot of it in the world. I don't see that much of it. I mean, this is maybe one of those times. And there's a lot of stuff. You know, some days I can't access it. You know, I mean, it's grim. We're facing a lot. You know, but I do believe that we can rise to the occasion. You know, I think, you know, I believe that, you know, in the next decades we're going to see people try at least really hard. I don't know if it'll work, but you know, in some ways this is like constitutional. I just have some kind of optimistic spirit. So, you know, and I mean, you know, I know a lot of people who are far more pessimistic, and with good reason. You know, with good reason. I mean, every day there's some ugly thing that just shows how broken each and every one of the institutions that rule our lives is. I mean, not a single one. It's just, you know, and it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to. I mean, in the Bay Area right now, things have gotten so desperate. The kind of level of suffering largely because of just how expensive it's gotten, you know, and it's hard to maintain that hope, because I see people just, you know, really stressed out, really ground down, but I know that I think you know, it won't be like this forever. Something's going to change in the next little period, and you know, you just have to kind of focus on that opening and try to pry it open. It's a great question. I don't have, you know, all the answers. Yeah.
I noticed that you mentioned the Bay Area. Well, I just remembered that Puget Sound has the same problem with housing being too expensive.
Absolutely.
And homelessness. Although one thing I must wonder is for the changes we want, for the changes we need. I wonder a lot of the time, I mean, how do we create those changes without creating a revolution back into another tyranny? So how do we create a revolution out of tyranny and not back into it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the question. Yeah, you know, I mean, to speak to the first part of what you said, I mean, there's a very West Coast. I mean, there's a couple things. There's a nationwide kind of rent crisis. I mean, you can go to you could go to Columbus, Ohio, or Milwaukee, and they're sort of relative to their own past and the wages in that place. They're dealing with an affordability crisis that seems to be largely, nationwide. Although there are some places that, because of their history, are not particularly expensive. But it's in lots of places. But it's also particularly extreme on the West Coast, right? In Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, and Portland are, it's just these cities that have just been, I edit this magazine. I have to come up with ways to try to describe our articles, and I'm editing this article about the housing crisis in California and on the West Coast, and I think of it as like the language I want to use is cities being poisoned by wealth. It's poisoned. Like the whole place has just been made toxic. And that's, that's at all of these cities. It's just, maybe a little worse in the Bay right now, but yeah, the West Coast is just, it has something to do with the technology industry, and, the gap between the kinds of wages that people who have these great jobs make and then everybody else. So yeah, I just don't see how it can go on. I mean, in the Bay Area they're saying that, all these firms that are sort of late kind of app companies are about to IPO. Lyft just IPO'd, but Uber and Airbnb and Slack and all of these companies are about to go public, which means that essentially it's just going to Lyft went public and 6,000 new millionaires were added to the city of San Francisco, right? They had enough money at that moment to buy every single house in the entire city, and so they're going to do this. They're going to do this 10 times over. And they're talking about the effect of like doubling the price of housing, which just seems unsustainable. I can't even imagine how, it's like a city that we've never seen anything like it. I don't even understand how it's going to work. Are they going to raise the minimum wage to $40 just to keep people, working in the cafes? I have no idea what it's going to look like, but it's completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
As for how to keep a revolution from sliding back within, to tyranny. I think that often my vision of a truly emancipatory revolution is like you have a revolution, and then there's a revolution within the revolution that kind of pushes it further. And the goal for me is to kind of distribute power as much as possible so that people can't be dispossessed, right? So, for me, one thing that you would want to avoid is, say, the kind of concentration and centralization of kind of armed power within a revolution. That's bad. Don't let that happen. Distribute decision making and control over resources as widely as possible, so that no one single group can kind of take it away from every other person. But that's going to be a fight, right? Because it's going to people say, no, let us have all this thing. We know what we're doing. We have this plan. Don't listen to them. Fight that. Fight to distribute power and disseminate it as much as possible, so that it can't be taken away from people. Yeah.
Reason like the notion that gun violence against people of color has been normalized and people didn't really care because the police, law enforcement, to this very day, kill African Americans and leave to get away with it, period. Whereas I think the day was the first day I learned that, I think last week, there was a mass shooting where people were being killed. I didn't hear anything about it at all. And they were saying on the radio station that before you feel like a really big deal when non-people, called the white people, got killed and don't like them, it wasn't even tolerated. Where they were saying now at that point where it's become so normalized, now it doesn't matter who it is, that gun violence has become normalized against anybody in the United States, trying to figure out where it comes from. So my question is, all places you go to, does it seem to you that gun violence is being normalized for everybody now, not just African Americans or marginalized groups, but for white people too? Or do you think people are just giving up on the whole gun lobbying machine?
Yeah, I mean, those questions are really complicated, because I think that there's both a process of normalization and a process of kind of heightening sensitivity, and it's paradoxical, but they kind of go together, right? Because you become oversensitized to something, and then you can't stay oversensitized to something for too long, and then you go back to kind of ignoring it. And so, I mean, clearly, clearly we are kind of immune in some sense to the fact that there's a kind of, epidemic of violence, and that the police are just this, incredibly violent institution that just kills, so many people, so many poor people, a lot of them white, but many of them and most, not. And it's a war on people who are poor. If you're homeless on the street, you can get killed. I do think that there's, I wouldn't say that, that the distinction between the kind of, murder of a white person and a non-white person has been erased. I think that there's still, I think people have different kinds of outrages, and, there's a way in which, I've thought about it a lot, about how these kind of really important things that I participated in have been provoked by, a particular act of violence by a police officer, and I never understand why it is this killing and not another one, because for every one that, for every Oscar grant, there's always, so many people who are in a very similar situation for which there was video evidence, every other condition held true, but nothing happens, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why, one incident produces a kind of uprising and another doesn't. I just don't, I don't know. And, so I worry about the idea that just showing these things, showing them, exposing the image is gonna produce change, because I think that in some ways, we have a lot of these images, and most of the time, images are news, and most of the time it doesn't produce anything, but every once in a while it does, and so, and the problem with it also is that it's like you focus on this particular act, but not all of the acts. How do you make it a movement about not just this one thing that was like egregious, but all of them, regardless of whether the person was armed, regardless of whether the person was a criminal or not, like even if the person is not innocent, they're all murderers, right? They're all part of this kind of, structurally violent system, and how do you move towards being against all of them, not just particular ones? And it sort of felt like that was happening for a while, right? That things were chaining together. And I still think, the one thing I will say is that I think there's been a big change in the country, just, talking to like my mom, for instance, about how people feel about the police, and I think that there's a lot of people who over the last year have kind of come to really just kind of accept the police as a deeply kind of broken and irreparable institution, and accept that police are murderers. And I think that's a widespread feeling, and that's something that gives me hope. Like I think that there is this real hatred of the police that's risen in this country, and I think that's a good thing. There's the French expression that comes out during the riots is, tout le monde déteste la police. Everyone hates the police. And it's not true. Not everyone hates the police, but sometimes it does feel like everyone does. That like even the police hate the police. So try to kind of go with that.
You talked about ransacking the past for ideas, and you quoted Marx, and I was wondering if you have any ideas of places we should be looking
For ideas?
Yeah, from the past.
Yeah. I don't know that. I just think you should just start pulling on a thread, whatever's interesting to you. There's so much amazing working class and radical history. There's so many things to read about. I would just say just start doing it, and read the next thing. I think it's great to read about the Paris Commune and the Mexican Revolution, and just kind of read, understand all this history. But that's not the only thing that one can do. So I wish I had one person that I could tell you to read right now, but I don't. Sorry. Yeah.
So first, thanks for being here.
Thanks.
In anticipation of your visit, my program read your Art and Revolution.
Oh, great.
And so we're kind of thinking about those. I'm teaching in the German program, so we're kind of referring a lot to the Frankfurt School's notions of estrangement and participations. And in your article, you refer back to Adorno's non-participation.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit, it'd be great to hear from you about sort of how the role of the negative dialectic or the non-participation can kind of fit into this radical hope for change.
Yeah.
And also maybe how you see yourself in your process of writing as a participant, observer, witness, activist.
Well, yes, thank you. So, I have this whole, I have all these kind of intellectual, theoretical problems where I can make arguments about things, and I wasn't really talking much about that so much today, although that informs my creative work. And so in this article that the professor mentions, it's sort of a follow-up to this book I wrote about about the transformation of people's working lives over the last several decades. And one of the things that's happened is that like people in these kinds of routine, kind of low-level positions in workplaces are being called upon to kind of emotionally invest in their work and being given these kinds of very superficial forms of like empowerment and self-management. But it's really a kind of technique of kind of control, right? To actually to kind of devolve more responsibilities on you and say, oh, well, we're kind of empowering you, but really what it means is we're making you do more work. So participation, there can be this kind of, we often think about participation as a good thing, we want to make classrooms, for instance. I think Evergreen probably has a model of teaching that's much more participatory, right? Like the idea of just sitting in a classroom and listening to someone talk is not the best model for learning. You want to have an engagement, a back and forth. You want there to be this kind of more participatory structure in which the relationship between the teacher and the student is kind of overturned, and the student teaches the teacher. And I love all that stuff. I try to do that myself. But there's a way in which those models, when they're taken up by workplaces, become this kind of tool of control, right? And technology does that too. Like have all this like power as kind of users to like customize and modify our environment, but really it's about kind of being participating in our own domination. So that's sort of what I'm talking about, is this long history of these ideas coming out of the avant-garde and all these great artists who had this kind of idea of democratizing the world through these participatory art practices and saying like, oh, I'm not going to make art, I'm going to make sort of a set of resources that spectators can use to make their own art, or I'm going to overturn the relationship between the audience member and the actors in the theater. And all that stuff is great, but over the course of the 20th century, it got turned on its head and is like now kind of used as a mechanism of control. Like the police come to your neighborhood and they're like, let's have a dialogue. I'd like to empower this community and sort of make them part of the kind of police procedures. And there's so many methods of kind of using these participatory mechanisms as tools of control. So that's basically the long and short of the article. And yeah, and I think that makes us rethink some of the people who were skeptical about these avant-garde ideas early, like Theodor Adorno, who was just this really grumpy guy. And I mean, I think he's sort of like grumpiness raised to the level of a kind of metaphysical principle, which is cool. But I mean, I have a lot of gripes with him too, because he's a deep pessimist. He really thinks nothing is possible. And I liked, in some ways, I prefer his colleagues who did have this optimism. I'm more of a Benjamin or a Marcuse than I am an Adorno. But his negativity is kind of radical, that he thought art was great because it refused to participate. It's like, no, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm refused to tell you what I mean, And like this kind of art that seals in, that turns in on itself like a kind of oyster and won't let you open it. But that's actually a true resistant thing, because it retains some kind of autonomy, right? And that's really an important term for him, is autonomy, and that can be sometimes the opposite of participation. My vision of the world is one in which there's autonomy and participation. So I think we those kind of that negativity, that kind of modernist negativity that Theodor Adorno, there might be something to it, but I think it's probably neither Adorno nor Brecht nor any of these people who really have the answers. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you.